catered event, but, I guess.
So it's agency and not private.
Agency. Yeah, that right there at the top there.
Yeah, okay. And shall I just call this workshop number 1?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, charging for
Corners, I use those now.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be completely.
that's not actually the standard.
So I got a few more out
I'm
there.
sure it will be.
Yeah.
Speakers now are always.
Yeah, but somebody asked me about that. Do you think it will be, one meeting will lead into the other, or I imagine there'll be a lot of review because well,
Stuff like that.
but your plan is to, yeah. Okay.
So you hear about all these potholes issues.
Oh, yeah.
Today's will be most.
That partly because of somebody
Yep. Thank God for hot mics. Yeah.
I hope that as we go through this and the ones who come, that some of these.
Someone's going to storm in here at the last minute, huh?
Well, maybe. My concern is that this is,
It's 5 minutes till.
you're going to be presenting a lot of foundational information that if people aren't here later on, they're not going to understand how that relates. That's what my concern is. This will just have to deal with that.
I don't know.
We might have to do.
A lot of people just live up the street.
Do they?
They're probably just, oh, I got filed. I'll roll in.
Could be.
Oh, and they're not going to say anything meaningful for half an hour anyways.
Right.
Show up late.
Coming here brings back a lot of memories. I used to live here, and it's just beautiful. Yeah, it's so fun out there.
Does your house have air conditioning?
Yeah, it does. But man, my power bill is put on more solar this year because last year it was true up plan. So at the end of the year, PGE basically looks at what you put on the grid and what you took off the grid, and at the end of the year they send you a bill of what the difference is. And last year it was $2,800
For the whole year?
for the year of additional. I mean, we didn't pay any
Oh.
power bill through the year until we came.
Yeah,
And we
but
paid $2,800.
that's like a little over 200 a month.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
And you have solar.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
So it's like that was a huge wake up call for us.
Do they send you a bill every month that they showing you like what?
No, but you can
where
get
you
online
stand?
and see. But it was really disturbing to say the least. So I hooked up my solar. I have a solar hot water system that I've been carting around with me forever. I even had it set up in Santa Barbara to heat my hot water from my house. And it's been in storage, so I brought it out. Now it's heating my hot tub. I haven't turned on that friggin' thing. So
It's going to be that time of year. At least at night.
right.
Around here.
Do you have a hot tub? Yeah. I have one in Oregon. I love it.
test, test. Okay. Sounds good. All right, you guys want to? Folks, it's 6:02 right now, and we have a packed program, and we only have this venue till 9 o'clock tonight, so we want to get started on time. And so if you'll have a seat, and I'll get started. So first of all, welcome and thank you for coming. Hopefully this isn't the first time you're hearing about Sigma. This is the first of 6 meetings, community meetings, what we're calling community meetings, regarding the development of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. Groundwater Sustainability Plan is a requirement under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which was passed in 2014 for the Carpinteria Groundwater Basin. We have 2 presenters tonight, Jeff Berry and Robert Marks. They're part of the technical team developing and putting together the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. I'll leave their credentials for them to introduce themselves. The presentation tonight will be 10 to 20 minute sections, and there will be 4 sections. And in between each section, there will be a pause for questions. Those questions, what we want to do is, if you didn't understand something in the presentation, take that time to ask a question. Those questions can be answered or can be asked from your seat, and what we'll do is have the presenter repeat the question so that we can get it on the recording that we're doing tonight. Then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session, kind of for broader questions about the whole process that we're going through. For those questions at the end, what I would ask is that you fill out a speaker slip and get it to me. I'll be sitting on the end of that table there, and then I'll call you up as you know, the line kind of dies down. We don't want to have everyone standing for 10 minutes, so I'll call you up like 3 at a time. So I've got a couple of announcements before the presenters get started. One of the things that we've been doing early on in the GSP process is trying to develop an infrastructure to get the message out, to make sure people are understanding what's going on, make sure that people are knowing when there's a meeting. So we've developed a website. It's an important tool where we'll be putting information about the process on a regular basis. We also are going to use the website to help us receive comments on the document itself. So the document's 8 sections, and we'll post a section up at a time. Starting tomorrow, sections 1, 2, and part of section 3 will be posted for comments. We want comments early so we can address them and make sure that we get them addressed in the document. But that comment period, of course, will go all the way till, I believe, sometime in the summer of 2023. But again, if you have comments, please get them in a little bit earlier. There's information on the table about Sigma and the GSP. There's also, as I said, speaker slips, so please utilize those. If you have a question but you don't feel comfortable coming up and speaking into the microphone, please write the question out in the little space provided on the slip, and we'll just read it into the record and answer it that way. Sign-in sheet. One of the ways that we get the information out is by email. So if you're interested in getting information about the process, and whenever we have board meetings, for example, whenever we have these community meetings, whenever something new is posted on the website, put your email on the sign-up sheet. And then finally, just an update. Some of you know about this, but the GSA is in the process of putting together a 7-member advisory board. And at least the short-term purpose of that board will be to assist the technical team and the Groundwater Sustainability Agency in answering questions and understanding certain nuances better. On the technical team, we have experts in Sigma and hydrogeologists, so they have very strong grasp of how the mechanical parts of this work. But what we don't have is the perspective of the users of the basin, so that's something that we'll be trying to use the advisory committee to help us with. So the update is that we've been working on putting that together. We're going to have an application process ready to go in November, so we'll start taking applications, and then we'll go through a selection process in December, and then start in January. So that's all I have. So with that, I'll introduce Jeff Berry.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Berry. I'm a hydrogeologist with GSI Water Solutions, and I am the lead for the consultant team putting the document together. And I've got Robert Marks here. He'll introduce himself here in a moment. We're going to throw a lot of information at you tonight. Most of the information tonight is really going to be foundational. It's important information about the geology of this basin, how the groundwater system works, factors that affect the groundwater system, the water budget, important elements that will feed into ultimately decisions that have to be made later on. So this is important piece of the process. I want to emphasize this is your plan. Our job is to listen, get your feedback, work through our issues if we have disagreements, and also, basically put this thing together in a manner that is going to be accepted by DWR in the end. That's the goal. So we'll help walk through that. There's probably going to be 6 or 7 workshops in the end. Each one will have different topics. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So our topics for tonight, I'm going to give some introductions, talk about what to expect in this process going forward, talk a little bit more about the stakeholder engagement process we have in mind. I'm going to just give a high-level overview of Sigma 101, that's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. What is it? How is it supposed to work? What does DWR expect? And Robert's going to be talking about the hydrogeological conceptual model. How does the groundwater system work in this geologic setting? Groundwater conditions, what's happening with water levels, et cetera. And then the historical and current water budget computations that we've done so far. There's another workshop in the future where we'll be presenting a future projected water budget that goes out 50 years. That's required by DWR, but it takes into consideration climate change and some other factors. We'll talk about that in another workshop. So here's your GSP development team. You see our directors in the GSA, Director Roberts, Holcomb, Stendal, Van Wingerden, sorry about that, and Director Johnson. We have GSA staff here, Bob McDonald, and then there's a whole cadre of folks here that are part of the consultant team, many of which you probably have seen names before. With GSI, we've got Robert and Mike who've worked for years and years here in this basin on the hydrogeology. Brian Bondi, who helped put together the GSA in the first place, he's a reviewer. And then other members, we have several folks from Katz Associates. They're going to be helping us and have been helping us with the stakeholder engagement and involvement, website material, things like that. So what to expect during the GSP development? So we are producing a GSP that is responsive to local needs and the needs that DWR has expressed in their guidance. We're going to give you an understanding of how the groundwater conditions work, or how the groundwater system works, an understanding of the historical, current, and then the future projected water budget. We'll talk more about what water budget means. It's an accounting of what's coming into the basin and what's leaving. Understanding of groundwater quality. Sustainable management criteria. You're going to get sick of that term, sorry to say. We'll get into that in a lot of detail later, but these are criteria by which we're going to be able to assess how well we're doing in managing this basin. We're going to get input from you on what those criteria need to be. What's considered undesirable? Where are the thresholds that we're going to set in the basin to maintain sustainability for the future? We're going to talk about projects and management actions. Should we find that we have data gaps or we find that we have a condition in the basin that needs to be addressed. So we're going to work with you to come up with what those projects and management actions are going forward. And that important point there is that DWR is giving us 20 years to get the basin into sustainable condition if it's not already. So every 5 years we'll be updating the GSP. We'll be evaluating as we go along every year in terms of how we're doing. And then, of course, the stakeholder engagement is a really critical part of this whole process. So from the stakeholder engagement perspective, we've got a number of key stakeholders. Many of you are in the room today. We have a list here. We plan, as Bob mentioned, to form a stakeholder advisory committee made up of many of these, if not all of these interests. We're going to post the GSP chapters on the website for your review, and we're looking for written comments. Certainly, we'd love to hear your comments and questions here in the workshops, but it's the written comments that we intend to respond to, and also tell you where in the GSP we responded to those questions and comments. That's a required element in the GSP. We want, and I think that's about it. You can see the web address there. You can find it if you get onto the GSP, the carpgsa.org website. So a little information about what is SGMA, what is it supposed to accomplish? Well, the legislation was established in 2019, passed in 2014. It's effective as of January 2015. It applies to basins that are defined by the Department of Water Resources. In Bulletin 118, it's their master document defining all the groundwater basins in the state. That's what we're living with right now, is that document. Now, it's possible to change boundaries in the future if we have good technical reason to do so, but we can't do that until DWR says that we can. So we have to write this GSP for the entire basin as it's defined by Bulletin 118. GSAs have 20 years to demonstrate sustainability, and for this basin, that means that we have, assuming we submit the GSP in 2024, or actually it'll be the end of 2023, we have until 2044 to achieve our ultimate goal for sustainability. Not sure if that's me.
Stay close to the mic.
Okay. Might be metal that I have in my body. The key to demonstrating whether a basin is meeting the sustainability goal, which you guys are going to help us set, is whether or not there are undesirable results. That's what DWR wants us to define, what's undesirable, and how do you measure it. And we'll get into a lot of detail about that later on. And then the sustainable management criteria, which are critical to defining sustainability that I mentioned before. So, some of you have heard about the 6 deadly sins. These are the 6 undesirable results that DWR expects us to address and discuss and evaluate. And I'll briefly cover each one of these, but you're going to hear more about this as we go forward in the workshops. So chronic lowering of groundwater levels. That's the lowering of the water table through pumping. The concern is through pumping. That's chronic, meaning it's year after year, and it continues to decline even after normal rainfall conditions return. Obviously, we've been in a drought for many years now, so you'd expect groundwater levels to decline. But it's not considered sustainable if rainfall returns for multiple years and we don't see the response in the groundwater system. That's what they mean by chronic. Reduction of groundwater and storage. Basically, think of it as a bathtub filled with gravel, in simple terms. So as the water table drops, you have less water in storage that's available to supply all the beneficial uses in the basin. And we have to evaluate that as part of our GSP. Land subsidence, many of you are familiar with some of the issues that happen when basins are overpumped. You take the water out of the basin, the sediments dewater and sometimes collapse, the clays collapse, and that causes land subsidence. And we're not seeing that here, so don't be alarmed, but it's something that we have to evaluate. And there are different ways in which we intend to evaluate it, and we'll present that information. Water quality degradation, another criterion that we have to look at, and that's both in terms of contamination. Is pumping or management actions moving a groundwater contaminant plume, or could it? It's also, are we drawing poor quality water into an aquifer that's affecting beneficial uses? That's another water quality concern. So we have to characterize what the water quality is in the basin. Interconnected surface water depletion, and what that means is in areas where groundwater is in proximity to the surface, and in particularly along the creek drainages, the issue is whether or not, number one, that groundwater is interconnected with the surface water, and how long is it interconnected, and where is it interconnected? So that is something that we have to evaluate. And along with that is we're evaluating whether or not that groundwater table is supporting what are called groundwater dependent ecosystems, GDEs. Those are plant and animal communities that are supported by groundwater, where the groundwater is interconnected with surface water. That's part of what we have to evaluate and discuss. Lastly, seawater intrusion, being here on the coast, it is an issue that we have to look at carefully. To the extent that lowered water table within the basin is causing seawater to intrude into our aquifer is a concern. So that's another undesirable condition that we have to address. And Robert will be talking about that. So here's our schedule. You can see in 2021, we completed the tasks that I've listed there. I won't bother to read them to you. 2022, these are the things that we've completed so far with the check marks. We're working on the workshops. We've got a draft of the monitoring networks plan that will be posted soon. And then we'll be working on sustainable management criteria through the end of this year. We're going to have several shots at that in workshops, so we'll be talking about that. That's why I show it here in later on in 2023. So we have monitoring well construction in 2023. It's in the planning stages now. Developing the sustainable management criteria, projects and management actions. The draft GSP will be coming out in October of 2023. That's where we'll have assembled all of the chapters that have been posted, all of the comments that we've received, address the comments, and you'll have another shot at did we address the comments properly? Is there something that we missed? And then ultimately we'll be submitting that, we'll be presenting that to the GSA board in November of 2023 for adoption. And once that's done, and assuming they adopt it, we'd be submitting that document to the DWR in December of next year. So I think that covers the meat of things. We'll be reviewing where we are on the schedule periodically, just so you can see the progress we're making. So that's it for the overview and the introductions. If you have any questions for me about Sigma or about our process, feel free. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the issue of rainwater and the effect on the groundwater. How does climate change fit into this? Where is that triggered?
So the question was, we talked about rainfall and its effect on the water table, and then you wanted to know how climate change fits into this. It fits in a couple different ways that we'll be evaluating. The Department of Water Resources has established some thresholds or some criteria that we're going to be using for precipitation patterns, temperature, evapotranspiration, and we'll be using those factors to adjust our historical water budget for the future, to generate a future water budget. And through that, we'll get to see the effects of the climate change based on the DWR factors that they've given us. We're probably also going to be looking at the effects of sea level rise, also in that process. Good question. Yes, sir.
Could you comment about the interconnection
good. Okay, what's an example of interconnected groundwater and surface water, and would a spring be an example of that? A spring could be an example of that, especially if it's supporting groundwater-dependent ecosystems, we have to identify that. But principally what we're worried about is where the water table in a principal aquifer, and then we'll get into that in a minute. Robert's going to talk about that tonight and the next workshop. That's where the water table is interconnecting where we have drainages, like Carpinteria Creek. Okay, so does the water table ever get high enough where it's actually, the groundwater's flowing into the creek drainage and then out to the ocean? That's the issue. And where does that occur and when?
Like an artesian well.
Well, in this case, it's more about places where the water table is just high. You know, it could be perched groundwater too, but it needs to be, we're going to define it in a manner that's, it has to be what's called the principal aquifer, where the GSA has responsibility to manage it. It can't be just, you know, perched water or up high in a watershed that has no relevance and is not pumped, for example. It is not something that the GSA is going to be managing. All right, well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Robert, and welcome Kate School students here. You guys can ask questions too. So Robert, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a great summary of Sigma, and you laid out a few of the issues that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So my name is Robert Marks again. I'm a principal hydrogeologist with Pueblo Water Resources. We're headquartered in Ventura. I've been working on groundwater and wells in the basin for the past 20 years or so. So it's a great pleasure to be a part of this process of building a sustainability plan for this basin. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about three topics that correspond to sections or chapters in the GSP. The first is the... So first I'll be talking about the hydrogeologic conceptual model, which is essentially the physical setting of the basin, its structure, geometry, where it is, how deep it is, those sorts of things. The groundwater conditions, so what's going on in the basin, primarily with regards to water levels and water quality. And then also the water budget, the current, or the historical and current water budget for the basin. So this is basically how much water is coming into the basin and when and from what sources, and how is water leaving the basin and when and from what sources. Now, as Bob mentioned, we'll be breaking this up into sections, so I have roughly 20 minutes of presentation material, give or take 5 minutes or so on each of these topics. After each one, I'll break again. We can have about 10 minutes of Q&A before we move on to the next section. My overall objective here is to provide a common understanding for everybody of the basics of the groundwater basin and the system, so that as we move forward and we start talking about things like sustainable management criteria and projects and management actions that may be necessary to achieve those criteria, we're all working from the same page in terms of how we understand the basin to be working. Now, due to the time constraints here, I'm going to have to cover these things at a very high level. So I'm going to be kind of flying at about a 30,000 foot level. And I'll be going over, or I won't be addressing lots of details. There are lots of technical details that I won't be able to get into tonight, but are described in the GSP. So, with that, let's get into it. So what is a hydrogeologic conceptual model? I'm not going to read the screen here, but basically what it does is it It provides an understanding of the physical characteristics of the basin, i.e. the geology, the geologic structure, the principal aquifers and aquatards in the basin, and it provides the context within which we develop water budgets, mathematical groundwater models, monitoring networks, etc. So SIGMA requires the use of best available information for the GSP. And there have been lots of studies done in the basin going back to the 1950s. And so everything that I'm presenting to you tonight and is in the GSP largely represents a synthesis of the information from all of these previous studies. In particular, some of you, the board members anyway, may be familiar with the 1976 Geotechnical Consultant Study, which is sort of the Bible of the basin, if you will. And then in 2012, Pueblo did an update to that report, and that included the development of a numerical groundwater model of the basin, which we'll be discussing in future workshops. So where is the basin exactly? So this is a topographic map, and it shows the basin boundary, and in a few slides I'll talk more about what the basin boundaries are constituted of and how they're delineated. But basically starting, whoops, sorry. So we're sitting right around in this general area here in the basin near Carpinteria Creek, sort of on the edge of the coastal plain in the basin. So the basin extends from the shoreline up through the coastal plain area, city of Carpinteria here, up to elevations of about 100 feet or so in this coastal plain area, but then also extends partway up into the hillside, in the foothills here, up until we get to the contact with bedrock, which I'll be discussing in a little while. On the east here, the boundary coincides with the Montecito groundwater basin to the west, and then extends southeast across Rincon Creek, which is the Santa Barbara-Ventura County line, and extends partway into Ventura County. So this map shows the major creeks in the basin. There are 5 major creeks in the basin. So starting in the west here, we have Arroyo Paredon Creek, Santa Monica Creek, Carpinteria Creek here, Gubernador Creek up in this area, and then of course Rincon Creek down here to the southwest. Toro Creek, the lower part of Toro Creek, also enters the margin of the basin over here. These creeks are principal sources of recharge to the basin. I would note that the Santa Monica and Franklin Creeks were concrete lined in the mid-1970s as part of flood control projects, and so they no longer contribute to the basin recharge. And there's one stream gauge in the basin. It's the USGS gauge on Carpinteria Creek, just downstream of the confluence with Gubernador Creek. So a lot of the calculations that we do with regards to stream flow, infiltration in the basin, key off of this gauge. Also shown on this map, which I'll be discussing in greater detail later, are the locations of surface water quality sampling stations that the district has on each of these creeks. So they collect samples on a semi-annual basis when there's water in those creeks. And I'll be discussing those data in a little while. So just in general, what is the basin? The basin is a geologic structural depression that's been filled up with unconsolidated water-bearing sediments. These sediments essentially consist of a thin veneer of alluvial deposits at the surface that are on the order of 50 to 100 feet thick in most locations. The alluvial deposits are underlain by the Casitas formation. That's the principal formation in the basin that most wells in the basin are tapped into. And that formation can get up to 2,000 feet thick in certain parts of the basin. And then underlying the Casitas formation is the Santa Barbara formation. And that gets up to about 1,000 feet thick in some places. The basin is physically bounded mostly by the hard bedrock formations in the mountainous areas. And then there's a jurisdictional boundary that I mentioned earlier with the Montecito Groundwater Sustainability Agency that coincides with the basin boundary with the Montecito Groundwater Basin. And then also the Pacific Ocean represents the formal southern boundary of the basin, because that's where the GSA has land use jurisdiction. But as I'll be discussing later, the basin sediments actually physically extend past the shoreline out underneath the Pacific Ocean, which is naturally related to the potential for seawater intrusion to occur in this basin. So here's a geologic map of the basin. This is a map of the surface geology. So there are geologists who go out there, they poke around, they look at satellite imagery, lots of other ways to delineate the surface geology. And we use the surface geologic map to define the boundary between basin sediments and the bedrock. So there's a lot going on this figure, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but the gist of it here is that within the basin boundaries, these lighter yellow and light brown colors represent the alluvial deposits that I mentioned before. And again, they occupy much of the surface in the basin area. The light pink colors here shown on the margins of the basin and down here in Ventura County is actually the Casitas formation that's exposed at the ground surface. The other important feature in the basin, which we'll be spending a lot of time talking about, and it's important for all of us to understand, is the Rincon Creek Thrust Fault here shown in red. This is a major fault in the basin, and it represents a structural impediment to flow across that boundary. And when I start showing you some cross sections in a moment, you'll get an understanding of why that is. So also shown on this map are these lines. These are cross section lines, which I'll be talking about here momentarily. We've constructed a half dozen cross sections through the basin. Sigma only requires 4, but we've done a half dozen because the basin is a little bit complicated. I'm only going to talk about 3 of them tonight, and I'll show you when I get to them exactly which ones they are, but just for reference, if you look in the GSP, we have cross sections through the basin along all of these different lines here. So before we get into the cross sections, as I mentioned, the Rincon Creek Fault represents a major barrier to flow in the basin. And the basin has been segregated into 2 storage units on the basis of the surface trace of that fault. North of the fault is known as storage unit number 1. South of the fault is known as storage unit number 2. So let's get into the cross sections. So the first section I'm going to show you is this section A prime, and it extends from the western boundary, goes through the heart of the basin to the southeast here, and crosses over Rincon Creek into Ventura County and then out to the other boundary here. So it's basically just going from west to east, and really captures and shows quite illustrates what the basin sediments look like in storage unit number 1, and then also what happens when we get over into Ventura County and we cross over the Rincon Creek Fault here and get into storage unit number 2. So here's cross-section AA prime. Now, what this is basically it's a vertical slice that we've taken through the basin. And so we're looking at it as if you were in the subsurface, sort of looking into the basin. And on the left is the west, and to the right is the east or southeast. So in this view, we're looking north. So it's like if you were standing at the shoreline in the subsurface and looking out towards the mountains. So what we see here is, again, the formations that I described earlier. We have a thin veneer of alluvial sediments, again, reaching maybe 100 feet thick in some places. Underlying that is the Casitas formation, which again reaches thicknesses of about 2,000 feet in the basin. And underlying that is the Santa Barbara formation. Now within the Casitas formation, in the central part of the basin, we have these zones of highly productive sands that have been identified in drilling logs and that can be mapped or correlated laterally within the central portion of the basin. And those have been designated from shallow to deep as the A zone here, the B zone, the C zone, and then the D zone. Now it's important to understand that these are not separate aquifers in the basin. There is one single principal aquifer in this basin, consisting again predominantly of the Casitas formation. What these are these zones of highly productive sands that have been delineated and are useful mainly for purposes of targeting screen zones in wells. So a lot of the wells in the basins are screened in one or more of these productive zones. In between these productive sand zones in the central part of the basin is lower permeability materials known as aquitards between these zones. Now, as you get out to the margins of the basin, these zones are no longer laterally continuous, and you start getting into regions where you just have pockets of sand, gravel, clay in sort of an undifferentiated stack. So working from the west and the boundary here with the Montecito area, we have the Arroyo Paredon Creek here. And as you can see, the thickness of basin sediments is quite thin near the boundary here. But as we get into the central part of the basin here, again, so in the vicinity of Santa Monica and Franklin Creeks, the basin gets quite thick. And then moving southwest, we get to Carpinteria Creek, and we still have quite a thick deposit of Casitas formation here. And then as we get over to Rincon Creek and we cross from the Santa Barbara County into Ventura County, we still do have some Casitas formation here, but that's juxtaposed up against the Rincon Creek Fault here. And what you can see here is that there's about 3,000 feet of offset on this thrust fault. And that has juxtaposed hard bedrock on the south side of that fault up against these basin sediments. And so in the areas where the Rincon Creek Fault is onshore, it does provide something of a barrier between the basin sediments and the Pacific Ocean. Now, once you cross over the Rincon Creek Fault in this area of the basin, we get into the really just the margin of what's left of storage unit 2, and the sediments here are really quite thin, but are nonetheless considered part of the basin. And again, here we have the basin boundary on the Ventura County side at the contact with these unconsolidated sediments and bedrock. So moving on to the next cross-section. So this next one is cross-section B prime. And as shown, this cross-section extends, again, from the bedrock boundary here in the mountain area, and then runs sort of sub-parallel to the Rincon Creek Fault through the heart of storage unit number 1, and then extends offshore. So here's what that section looks like. So again, we're looking more or less north here, but at a slightly different angle than section A was. So I'm going to start from a little bit different direction here. So I'm going to start up here on the bedrock boundary. So again, we have these thin alluvial sediments overlying bedrock as we get to the basin boundary up here, and we have bedrock exposed in the foothill area up here. But as we go downhill and we start getting into the central part of the basin and out of the foothill area, you can see the basin sediments thicken quite dramatically. And again, we get into this area here where the Casitas Formation is on the order of a couple thousand feet thick. Now, what we're really trying to convey with this cross-section and what sort of differentiates it from the A section is this section extends offshore. So right here is the formal basin boundary, that's the shoreline. But as you can see, these sediments extend offshore and are underneath the Pacific Ocean. So these wells that are in this part of the basin are in sediments that are, we believe, in hydraulic communication with the Pacific Ocean. Now, I would note that offshore, we have a fairly high degree of confidence in the contact between these unconsolidated basin sediments, the Casitas Formation, and the underlying bedrock from all of the oil wells that have been drilled out there. But those oil wells, they don't care about any of this stuff, and so they don't really do a very good job of logging it. They go, oh, it's unconsolidated, and they go, okay, cool, we got into the Sespe. And then they drill the thousands more feet below the Sespe down into the Monterey, and that's where the oil is. So again, we have a pretty good idea of that we do have basin sediments offshore, but the actual structure and orientation of these main producing zones, the A, B, C, and D aquifers, is based on essentially extrapolation of the shape and geometry of those units onshore, and then what we know about what's going on with the bedrock. And so we've just projected our best guess as to how these zones exist offshore. And that's why you see these question marks here. These are queried. So what that means is we don't have a high degree of certainty on the exact geometry out here, but we do, again, know the main point here is we have basin sediments that extend offshore. Now moving on to the last cross section, this is section F prime. So this is more towards the, the southwestern part of the basin. This one's oriented a little more north-south and crosses over into storage unit 2, into the heart of storage unit 2. And then I'll show you the relationship between the Pacific Ocean in this area of the basin. So again, starting in the bedrock area, we have, sorry for that, I don't know what happened with the graphic there, but we'll fix that. We have the basin boundary being defined by the contact of these unconsolidated sediments with bedrock. We have a pretty deep thickness, again, of the Casitas Formation underlain by the Santa Barbara. And again, this Rincon Creek Fault. And so you can see there is quite a bit of offset on this fault where we again have these hard bedrock formations thrust up and over the basin sediments. And this fault is at a pretty steep angle. It's kind of hard to get a real sense of it because there's some vertical exaggeration on this, but it's actually at about a 45-degree angle. So it overhangs from storage unit 2 into storage unit 1. And so we have storage unit 1 basin sediments up against the underlying overhanging part of the fault. And then crossing the Rincon Creek Fault, we get into storage unit number 2. Now, storage unit number 2, as shown, is compared to storage unit number 1, quite thin. And really the only deposits that we have in storage unit number 2 that yield any water to wells anyway are the alluvial deposits, which are underlain by the Santa Barbara Formation, and we get up to a maximum thickness of around 400 or 500 feet thick in this unit. And then there's another relatively minor fault here compared to the Rincon Creek Fault called the Carpinteria Fault, which again has some offset on it. We have the same thrusting on the south side of the fault, which is bringing bedrock up against the basin sediments in storage unit 2, and essentially providing a physical barrier between storage unit number 2 and the Pacific Ocean. Now, as I mentioned, in the central part of the basin, we have the basin sediments have sorted themselves out into these alternating layers of low permeability materials, the A, B, C, and D sands, which are in between each of those sand units is thicker aquitard or low permeability materials. And in the central part of the basin, the low permeability materials that extend essentially from the ground surface down to the top of the A zone represents essentially a clay cap between the ground surface and the underlying principal aquifer system. And that clay cap prevents any significant vertical percolation of water from the surface down into the deeper principal aquifer units. Yeah, so that the presence of that clay cap has been used to delineate and segregate the basin into what's known as a confined area, shown here in this purplish color, I guess. And so what we have here is this laterally extensive clay on top of the A unit that confines the water in the A unit under artesian pressure, and also, as I mentioned, limits the amount of vertical percolation of water from the surface. And this becomes very important when we start talking about the water budget and where we understand water to be recharging the basin and where we think that water isn't really recharging the basin, but rather just kind of skimming across the top and discharging out to the ocean. So how'd I do on time? Okay. Well, I'm going to pause there. I'll take questions. I think the way we're going to do this is if you guys raise your hand, if I can hear your question, I'll repeat it, and then I'll try to answer it. We have about 10 minutes allocated for this before we move on to the next section. Any questions about this? All right, you, sir, in the front row.
So you talk about that slice, and obviously you didn't slice it. So is that information gathered from well drilling logs, or how do you know? You talk as though you're pretty confident about what you showed us.
Yeah.
How did you get that information?
Yeah, that's an important point. It is based on well logs. So these cross sections show the presence of well logs. So this is section B, B prime, and we've selected So the section line goes through wells that we have logs for that are of sufficient detail and reliability that we can make these picks. So what we do, and a lot of this comes from the previous investigations in the basin that I mentioned earlier. But so for this well here, for example, I think this is one of the district's wells. That well is about 900 feet deep or so. And based on our review of the driller's log, we made picks on where the A and the B zones were. And then we have another well at the shoreline here, and then a couple of other wells. This deep well actually is an oil field wildcat well, so we also use, to the extent that we can, and the driller's logs are of sufficient detail to be useful. And basically what we're doing is we're interpolating between these well log points to sort of fill in the blanks. So it is a little bit like, you know, the three men and the elephant. You know, you touch different parts, you get a different picture. You know, the best basin is one that only has 3 wells in it. It's easy to make a pick and pick a plane and define geometry based on 3 points. But that's somewhat hyperbolic. The more data we have, the more wells that are drilled in the basin that have good quality logs, which is an issue here, the better, and the more confidence we have. So certainly if there are more wells drilled, some of these interpretations could be adjusted if we find something different than what we've been interpolating between the existing information. But again, this is based on the information we have available at this time. You, ma'am?
Could you go over the last 2 maps that you used and show where, say, where Carpinteria is and where Montecito is, maybe?
So she wanted me to show where Carpinteria is on this map and Montecito. So on this map, the city of Carpinteria is generally in this area here and sort of straddles the boundary between storage unit number 1 and number 2. I believe we're sitting right now right around this area here along Carpinteria Creek and Casitas Pass Road. And then Montecito is all the way over here outside of the basin. Montecito has its own groundwater basin, and they're doing their own GSP. But we do share a jurisdictional boundary right here with the Montecito groundwater basin.
See, it was my understanding that Montecito didn't have much of an aquifer. Am I generalizing too much?
I've heard that general characterization. I haven't personally done much work in Montecito, but I have heard similar things.
Could you go to that one more map, Pam? Or I don't know, that was the last one. I want that one that shows the earthquake.
Oh, the fault?
Or the last one. Is that the last one? There, that, the purple. That one,
Cross-section.
there.
This one. Okay, yes. So this is a cross-section, so we're looking at it in profile view, if you will, not looking down on it like a map, but looking at it sideways. Again, imagine yourself a couple thousand feet below the ground surface looking at this. Did you have a question about?
Where would you see Carpinteria?
Oh, okay. The city of Carpinteria is sort of in this area here on this figure. The city limits anyway. Out in this area is where we have a lot of the agricultural activities. This is location of Carpinteria Creek right here for reference.
And so over to the east, if that's the, if I understand correctly,
Well, on this one, we're looking west. Yeah, so no, Ventura County is not shown on this particular one.
Robert, maybe if you go to A prime, please. That's
Yeah, so this one, the first cross-section I showed you extends through the heart of the basin. So city of Carpinteria is in this general vicinity here, and then it crosses the Rincon Creek Fault. And this area here is Ventura County. So that's shown here on this cross-section. So again, here's the county line. So on this side is Santa Barbara County, to the west, and then to the east, southeast is Ventura County. Looks like I'm
question on that one. Do basins have a slope? And that is to say, if there's a well in the sweet spot of the basin, will it pull water from the outlying wells?
possibly.
Make sure I repeat the question.
Oh, could you repeat the question, sirs?
So do basins have a slope, and would the water move from one side of maybe the shallower side of the basin to the deeper side if water is being pulled out of that sweet spot area?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll talk a lot about that when I get to the groundwater conditions section in the next topic. You, sir, in the hat?
Thank you for mentioning the fact that Santa Monica Creek and Franklin Creek are both channelized throughout much of Carpinteria. And it occurs to me that that might be an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. I mean, every time I drive by Santa Monica Creek, I'm still amazed that even now there's water there and some life and some frogs hanging out down in there. And I know that basin recharge efforts like in Ventura County along the Santa Clarita River have been somewhat successful. Seems to me that, is that something that our GSA would fall in their purview?
Certainly, that de-lining of those creeks is a potential project that could be implemented to increase recharge from those creeks in the basin. And in fact, that type of project was evaluated and modeled by the Water Management District back in the 2012 report. As I recall, the amount of recharge from those two creeks wasn't a ton of water. So we're talking maybe adding a few % or so, I think, to the overall water balance. But certainly that's potentially something that the GSA might want to consider as a potential project, absolutely. You, sir.
How many acres does the basin, surface acres, does it represent?
He asked how many acres the basin represents, and thank you for that question, sir. I neglected to say that at the very beginning. The basin area is around 8,000 acres, or about 12 and a half square miles is the total basin area.
How much of that is privately owned?
That, sir, I don't have a good answer for you right now. I'm not sure.
It appears that it's pretty much 100%. Is that close?
I'll-
Well, you seem to be on your map, hard to read. It looks like the forest boundary and the basin boundary look pretty close to the same. Is that correct?
I can't comment on the forest boundary and the vegetation. I can only say that the boundary of the basin is a little bit up into the hillside, so we get up out of the plain area into the hilly area, and the boundary is drawn solely on the basis of that geologic mapping and where the geologists have delineated the contact, the physical contact on the ground surface between the hard rock, bedrock formations which don't yield water readily to wells, to the sand, gravels, and clays, which do yield water to wells.
Thank you.
Young lady in the corner there.
Yeah, so I drive by the marsh every day, and I'm wondering how that plays into what we've been talking about, like where it is on the map, and its role in absorbing seawater and rainwater, and how, you know, on this map, like where is it?
Well, on this map, so we're looking, so she's asking, she said she drives by the salt marsh every day. She wants to know where it is and what kind of role it plays. I'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the water budget for the basin, but generally, on these maps, the salt marsh is this area here. And it's a tidal marsh. So there is water in that marsh. A little bit comes in from the two creeks that feed it, Carpinteria Creek and Franklin Creek. But if you've gone by there during high tides and low tides, it's tied to the ocean. So most of the water that's in that marsh is actually seawater and a mixture of fresh water and seawater. But in terms of how it contributes or doesn't contribute to basin recharge, that salt marsh is located in the confined area here. So it's in an area of the basin where underneath that marsh, and then extending further out into the basin, we have a very thick clay layer that's on the order of 200 to 300 feet thick that prevents or limits significantly the amount of vertical percolation from that marsh down into the lower parts of the principal aquifer system. How are we doing on time?
I think we gotta move on.
Okay. Got time for one more?
Yeah, one more. And remember, you'll have a chance to ask these questions at the end of the presentation.
Yeah.
We wanna get through them.
I know there's lots of good stuff here. I could talk about this for hours. But, you, ma'am.
Well, I'm kind of going back to the Franklin Creek and the Santa Monica Creek.
Okay.
Concreted, because I lived here all my life, so I remember when it was not concreted, and I lived near it. And there's a fair amount of rain water that goes down there when we have a good rain. So there is a fair amount of water that could be trapped and put back into our aquifers if that was no longer concreted.
So she's just commenting that she's lived in the basin for quite a while and has been around since before the Santa Monica and Franklin Creeks were concrete lined, and has observed quite a bit of water in both of those channels over the years. And her valid comment is that there's quite a bit of water that, because those creeks have been lined with concrete, and the reason they did that was because there was a lot of flooding. And the idea back in those days was line the creek channels and get that water when it rains, get it out of the basin as quickly as you can so you don't have flooding.
Remove
But
the debris from the creeks with the fallen trees and whatever, we might not have as much of a flooding problem as we did in the past, kind of thing.
Certainly.
And I mean, we also have the concrete that comes down from Foothill Road, Casitas Pass to Foothill, and that has quite a bit of slope in it also.
yeah, absolutely. Now, just as an aside, I would note that if you go out to those creeks like right now, there's probably some water in them, but that is not rainfall. What that is that's tile drainage predominantly from the agricultural areas where they're watering the crops, and they have these French drains basically that capture the water and shunt it out into the creek. So that's what most of the water is under these conditions. But certainly when we get rainfall, those creeks represent a potential source of recharge in the basin.
I have one last question akin to hers.
Yes, sir.
If you are considering de-lining a concrete channel like Franklin and Santa Monica Creeks, and as she said, we all know prior to those creeks being lined, there was negative impact to flood hazard maps if you're de-lining a creek? Or the opposite side of that coin, is there a way to allow for the free flow of water in a natural creek, but not add to a potential flood hazard, particularly from the FEMA point of view? And that all breaks down very simply to dollars and cents for homeowners.
So
Robert, before you answer that, I think we want to move this to the end. This is a larger subject that I think it's going to require the three panelists to talk about. So is it all right if we pick that question up at the end? Okay, thank you.
Okay, well with that, let's move on to groundwater conditions in the basin. So there's quite a bit to cover here. I'm already running behind apparently on my previous presentation, so I'm going to cover these things at an even higher level, but I'm going to concentrate on trying to get the main points across here. So we're going to be talking about the water level conditions in the basin, water quality conditions in the basin, also what we know about seawater intrusion, the potential for seawater intrusion in the basin, what we've done to assess the interconnectedness of the creeks, the surface water bodies in the basin to groundwater that Jeff mentioned. And those are related quite strongly to groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on the land subsidence issue. So water levels. The Water Management District has a network of a couple dozen monitoring wells in the basin that they collect water level data from. And those wells are shown here as these dots with their IDs associated with them. And as you can see, they're scattered throughout the basin. There are only 3 of them here in the storage unit number 2 on the south side of the fault. So what happens is the Water Management District goes out to these wells on a bi-monthly basis, so every couple of months, and they go out and they physically measure the water level in these wells. So I'm going to talk about just a handful of the wells and what we've been seeing in those water level data over the past several decades. And I'm just going to try to cover sort of, specific areas of the basin. So this first one is a water level hydrograph for well ID 19F4, which is located in the western portion of the basin shown here. Now let me describe this graphic to you a little bit. So on the bottom axis here we have the date and time, and so this is time moving from the left to the right, increasing in time. So we start out in 1940, actually back when the U.S. Geological Survey was collecting these data before the Water District even existed, through the current period. On the left axis here is the depth to water. So as I mentioned, someone from the Water District physically goes out to one of these wells on a bi-monthly basis, and they run a sounder down the well, and they measure how deep it is below the ground surface to the water table. So what we're presenting here is actual data. This is not the result of an analysis or any kind of interpolation or anything like that. This is just, these are the data. Because we know what the ground surface elevation is at each of these monitoring well locations, it's easy to convert that to a water surface elevation. So on the right axis here is what those depth to water measurements translate into in terms of elevation. And the blue line here is what all of those data points are that have been collected over these decades, connected by lines between the data points. So just, I'm going to go over this very quickly. So starting in the 40s when data were starting to be collected here again by the USGS, we have a relatively low water level period here in the late 40s and 50s. Some water level recovery here, particularly after water started being imported into the basin with the Kachuma project. And we have fairly stable water level conditions, more or less goes up and down through here until we get to the most recent drought, not our current drought, but the previous drought of the late 1980s and into the early 90s, where we see significant water level declines here, followed by a significant period of water level recovery coming out of that late 80s and 90s drought into the 2000s or so. A little bit of decline here in the 2010s until we get to about 2012, which is when our current drought that we're in the middle of right now starts. And again, here we see significant declines in the water levels at this location, with water levels getting as deep as 25 feet below sea level here. So moving on, here's another water level hydrograph. Same way of plotting it. It's collected the same way. This well is actually up in the hilly area, sort of in the vicinity of Shepherd Mesa, kind of toward, this is Gubernador Creek here, Rincon Creek there, so it's in this area here. And again, here we see really low water levels in the late 40s and 50s, followed by a quite dramatic increase in water levels. Again, until we get into this late 80s, early 90s drought period where we see water levels decline significantly, followed by another period of water level recovery and fairly stable water levels, and then again, a very dramatic decline in water levels during our current drought period. Now this well is at an elevation of 425 feet, so even with these dramatic declines in water levels at this location in the basin anyway, we're still well above sea level. This next one, we're moving a little bit away from the hilly area down into the central part of the basin. This is well 27F2. This is the district's Smiley well, located adjacent to Carpinteria Creek, just like right over there. Yeah, right over there, not too far away. Now this well was drilled in the mid-1970s by the Water Management District, so we obviously don't have data going back into the 40s for this well, but we see similar pattern here. So we get into the late 80s, early 90s drought period, significant declines followed by a period of recovery, fairly stable water levels, and then again into our current drought period here where we have very significant declines at this well, and water levels have gotten most recently on the order of about 50 feet below sea level at this well. Here's another well in the general vicinity, similar area of the basin as Smiley well, but now we're getting into the confined area, so we're sort of on the edge of the confined area here. This well has been around since the 40s, so we see similar patterns here of declines during these drought periods, followed by periods of recovery and then decline again. Now this well is located right at the coast. This is 30D1. It's right near Santa Claus Lane, and it's actually partially into the marsh area. This well has been around for a very long time. There's not a whole lot known about this well in terms of how deep it was or is, how it was drilled. There's no log for it, so we don't know a lot about this well, but data have been collected from it nonetheless. And again, we see similar patterns here of water level declines during these drought periods. Most recently, water levels at this well have been on the order of 25 feet below sea level. But because this well is at such a low elevation, it's less than 10 feet above sea level, When we get into these high water level periods, this well is actually flowing under artesian pressure. Right? So this well is in the confined area, as I mentioned, and the water is held under pressure. And so that allows it to actually flow at the ground surface. Now, all of these water level data from all of these different monitoring points can be contoured to show what the water table surface looks like at any given point in time. And what we do is we take water level data from a specific period of time. So in this case, it's the spring of 1999, which represents a high water level period. So the basin is basically full under these conditions. And what we can do is we know the elevations of the water table at each one of these monitoring points, and we draw contour lines between these points. And each one of these lines is a line of equal elevation. And so these are 10-foot contour intervals. So starting at the coast here, we have a 10-foot contour interval. So that means the water table elevation is 10 feet above sea level here. 20 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet, etc. And then we get up into the hilly area here, and you can see that the water level contours, there's a lot of contours here, and the water table surface rises quite rapidly in this part of the basin, somewhat mimicking the topography. Now, the other important piece of information that we can get from these contour maps is that, at the risk of sounding glib, water flows downhill. So water flows from areas of high elevation or high head to lower elevation. So what I've added to these maps here for the presentation tonight are a couple of arrows showing the direction of groundwater flow in the basin based on these contours. And I think this goes to a question a gentleman asked earlier. So what we see here in this part of the basin is water is flowing from the upper reaches of the basin near the bedrock boundaries towards the central part of the basin and continues through the central part of the basin. And even here at the shoreline, we have water, a seaward gradient, meaning the water level within the basin is higher than sea level, and water is flowing from the basin for the onshore portion of the basin to the offshore areas. So again, this is spring 1999, a high level water condition. Here's the fall of 1991. So as I mentioned, we were talking about all those hydrographs. 1991 was the end of that last significant drought in the basin. And what we see here is, again, we have water flowing. We have water levels above sea level still in the hilly areas, and water flowing from those hilly areas towards the central part of the basin. But what we're showing here is the development of a depression in the water table surface. And water levels in this area are actually below sea level. So as I mentioned when I was going through the hydrographs, we have water levels at some locations on the order of 40 or 50 feet below sea level at this time. And so what that means is, again, water flows down gradient or downhill, if you will, in terms of the water table surface. And when we have these depressions in the water table surface inland, that creates a situation where water can move from the offshore areas of the basin, and we have a reversal of the seaward gradient that we saw during the high basin water level conditions to a low basin water level condition, and water is now moving this direction from the shoreline towards this depression. And so just moving on, I just have one more here. This is the fall of 2020, which is essentially current conditions, at least as far as we've been taking the data for this GSP. And you can see these conditions in fall of 2020 are quite similar to what we saw in the fall of 1991. We have a significant depression in the central part of the basin, water levels 50, 60 feet below sea level here, and again, water flowing towards that depression from other parts of the basin, and in particular from the shore, from across the shoreline. So moving on to water quality. In addition to measuring water levels at wells located throughout the basin, the district collects water quality samples from a variety of wells in the basin, some of which are the same wells that they measure water levels at. Some of the wells are just strictly water quality. They collect water quality samples on a semi-annual basis. In general, the overall quality of water in this basin is quite good. It has a calcium bicarbonate character, which may be meaningful to those of you who are trying to grow crops here. And the Central Coast Water Quality Control Board basin plan for this basin establishes water quality objectives for specific constituents. And those water quality objectives are intended to serve as a basis for managing water quality trends in the basin. And so as shown on the slide here, the water quality objectives for total dissolved solids, or TDS, is 700 milligrams per liter, or parts per million more commonly. Chloride is 100 milligrams per liter, and then nitrate as nitrogen is 7 milligrams per liter. I don't have a lot of graphics for the water quality stuff, so I'll just give you some numbers, if you will. Before I move on, though, there are a couple of wells that I'm going to be talking a lot about here in the next couple of slides, and it's these two wells over here, 19E1 and 19E1 and 19K5, where there are some things going on that we're going to talk about. So with regards to total dissolved solids, the concentrations range between about 600 to 900 milligrams per liter at most locations in the basin, so right around that 700 water quality objective level. Now, notable exceptions are those two wells that I just mentioned, 19E1 and 19K5, located in the western portion of the basin, sort of in the vicinity of Arroyo Paradon Creek, where we've seen quite high levels of total dissolved solids there, and have increased during the recent years from 1,000 up to 1,500 milligrams per liter, so almost double the water quality objective. And similar patterns happening in this nearby well. Excuse me. So chloride, which contributes to total dissolved solids, it's one of the solids that makes up the total dissolved solids. Chloride concentrations in the basin range between about 40 to 80 milligrams per liter at most locations in the basin, which is well within the water quality objective of 100. At most locations, but a couple notable exceptions include those two wells that I mentioned earlier, where we see an increasing trend in chlorides there. And then also at a Sentinel well, a recently drilled Sentinel well, which I'll be discussing later in the context of seawater intrusion. Nitrate, overall nitrate concentrations in the basin, are well below the water quality objective, and we do see it's not cut and dry, but there's sort of a pattern where deeper wells tend to have lower concentrations of nitrates compared to shallower wells, and that may reflect influence from agricultural fertilizer in those areas. But again, we still see these increasing trends at those same two wells. that we've had those issues with TDS and chloride in. We also have them with nitrate. Things aren't quite as bad at this well 19E1. They've gone from 2 to 12 recently. 19K5 has had kind of a strange pattern. It's gone from 38 to 62, but has recently been going back down. And then there's another well in the eastern part of the basin where we've seen some increases, but then that's been mitigated somewhat in recent years. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, and so this is the same surface water map that I showed you at the beginning, the water district collects samples from the surface water in the basin at the stations shown here with these red dots. And they collect those also on a semi-annual basis when surface water is present. Now, importantly, they're collecting these samples at the boundary with the bedrock, so what the implication or the meaningfulness of these data is that we're getting what the quality of the water is entering the basin from these sources. And so again, here we have the USGS gauge that I mentioned before. So this one's a complicated graphic of trying to cram a ton of information in one slide. But what we have here is 3 panels of the surface water quality data. This top panel is total dissolved solids. So these are the total dissolved solids data from those sources, from those creeks. The middle panel is nitrate, and then the lower panel here is chloride. And these data are covering the period from about 2000 to 2020. And that coincides with the start of the data collection program of the Water District's groundwater management plan under Assembly Bill 3030. I guess the main points I want to show here, and that relates to my discussion about what we've seen at some of these wells, is that Arroyo Paredon Creek, shown on the green line here, has very high levels of total dissolved solids compared to Rincon Creek or Carpinteria Creek. Similarly, Arroyo Paredon Creek has very high levels of chlorides in it compared to these other creeks. And then with regards to nitrate, we have Toro Creek, which, as I mentioned before, just kind of comes into the western margin of the basin. It's just the lower part of Toro Creek crosses into the basin. But Toro Creek has high levels of nitrate in it. Not sure what to make of this data point up here. It could be bad data, but again, the levels are quite a bit higher in Toro Creek than Carpinteria Creek or Rincon Creek. So to the extent that the surface water quality is affecting the water quality observations, in particular at those wells that I mentioned, is something that the GSA is going to need to be looking into and perhaps managing during the implementation of the GSP. So now let's move on to the topic of seawater intrusion. So this is the same cross-section I showed you guys earlier. This is section B, B prime, and I just want to reiterate that we have the shoreline here with basin sediments extending offshore and are believed to be in hydraulic communication with the Pacific Ocean. Now, the Water Management District recognized that several years ago, well, going on a decade or so now, that the one monitoring well that we've had in the basin, that well 30D1 that I talked about, where we've been getting water level data from, we didn't know anything about it, really. We didn't know how deep it was. We didn't have a log. You know, we had sounded it and those kinds of things, but, you know, it appeared that the well had been collapsed. And nevertheless, it wasn't very deep. So prior to the drilling of the Sentinel wells by the Water District, there really weren't any wells in the basin that penetrated the deeper aquifers, in particular the A, B, and C producing zones that were capable of detecting seawater intrusion even if it had occurred. So the district wisely drilled in 2019 a set of 3 separate borehole monitoring wells. They were completed with screens discretely in, so there's one well in the A zone, that's somewhere around 100 to 300 feet or so. The B zone, which is down around 850 feet or so, and then the C zone here, which is about 100 feet thick, extending from about 1,000 feet to 1,100 feet below sea level here. Now, what these wells have done is they allow for the collection of water level and water quality data through routine monitoring, which I'll show you that data in a moment. And really the idea here and why they're referred to as sentinel wells is that they could serve as an early warning indicator for seawater intrusion occurring in the basin. So as I mentioned, the district's been collecting water level and water quality data from all 3 of these wells. This is a graphic that shows both types of data. The upper panel shows water quality data. So we have electrical conductivity and chloride, both of which are indications of the relative salinity or saltiness of the water. And then the lower panel here shows the water level data. Now these wells, unlike the other monitoring wells that I mentioned where they go out and they physically sound the well every couple of months, these wells have been instrumented with pressure transducers and data loggers, and they collect the data point every hour. So we have quite a bit of data here. We're catching tidal fluctuations and other things here. So this is the shallowest well. This is MW3 in the A zone. Again, it's around 200 to 300 feet deep, the screen zone. And with regards to the water quality, what we can see here is that since it was drilled and data was started to collected in 2019, water quality has not changed at this well. In particular, the chloride level has been below the water quality objective of 100 milligrams per liter consistently throughout this time, regardless of what's happening with the water levels. Now, what we're showing here in these water levels is that the water levels are consistently below sea level in this well. They range between, when we first started collecting data, between 10 to 5 feet below sea level. And then in the past year or 2, things have gotten a bit deeper here, and water levels are now about 15 feet below sea level in this zone at this location right on the shoreline. This is the intermediate well. This is the B zone well, MW2, and from a water quality standpoint, we can see that things have been a little bit variable here. They started out high. Chloride in particular was above the water quality objective, but it's kind of gone up and down, and more recently has been fairly stable, and chloride levels have been just barely above the water quality objective. And there doesn't seem to be a real direct correlation at this well between the water level conditions and what's going on with the water quality. They just kind of seem to be somewhat disconnected. Now the water levels in this well, we see quite a bit more fluctuation. And in particular in recent years here, we see quite a bit of decline at this well. And in fact, water levels during several months in 2022, earlier this year, got below the depth setting of the transducer that the district had installed there. And so that's why these are flat lines here. The water levels actually got below the transducer setting. That has since been rectified. The transducer's been dropped down, I think, to 50 feet or more now. So now going into the deep zone, the C zone. So now we're talking 1,000 to 1,100 feet below sea level here. And we see something different going on at this well. When we drilled the well and we initially collected samples from it, water quality, kind of looked all right, not unlike the other 2 wells. Chloride level was just a little over 100 milligrams per liter there. But what you see here is over the past couple of years, these levels of chloride and electrical conductivity, which are again indications of the salinity or the saltiness of the water, it's getting hotter, if you will. We're seeing, I mean, I'm not going to beat around the bush. This is potentially indicative of the early stages of seawater intrusion occurring in this zone at this location. And again, we're seeing this increase in concentrations of the salinity of this water, regardless of what's happening with the water levels in this well. So water levels are a little bit higher in the well here. We do have periods where it's at or slightly above sea level. We have a decline here, and then a rise, and then another big decline in the past year or two. But again, we don't see the chloride or electrical conductivity varying much in response to those water level conditions. So that's the bulk of what we have on seawater intrusion right now. The district also recently performed some geophysical surveys along the beach. You guys may have seen those folks. It was about a year or so ago out there. And the purpose of those geophysical surveys was to try to gain a better understanding of the distribution of these highly conductive zones. And unfortunately, the results of that geophysical survey were somewhat inconclusive. And so there needs to be more work, future surveys done to make those data more meaningful. And so that's why I'm not spending any time talking about that here tonight. But that information about the geophysical surveys is presented in the GSP, and it's well documented there. So moving on now from seawater intrusion to interconnected surface water and groundwater. Now Jeff mentioned this in his preamble here. There are basically three ways that creeks interact and are connected or not connected to streams. The first is a gaining stream condition, or what's referred to as a draining stream condition, shown schematically in this upper block diagram here. And in a gaining creek condition, what you have is you have water levels in the principal aquifer actually above or higher than the water level in the creek or the stream, and water is actually seeping from the groundwater system into the creek, and therefore the creek is gaining flow from the groundwater system. But it's connected in this situation. You can see the water table is connected to the creek bed. We have another situation where we still have a hydraulic connection. The water table surface is close enough to the creek bed that it is hydraulically connected, but the water levels in the aquifer system as you go away from the creek channel are lower than the water surface in the creek, and this is what's referred to as a losing stream. So in these situations, water is seeping from the creek beds out into the groundwater system, so the creek is losing flow, and it's going out into the groundwater system, but again, it's connected, and so the rate at which water is losing from the creek is dependent upon the gradient between the creek and the groundwater system. In either one of these upper two conditions, pumping by groundwater wells can affect the flow in the creeks. And if that happens, then that means that needs to be managed by the GSP and the GSA. And then there's a third condition where the creek is a losing creek, but it's physically disconnected from the water table. So what's happening here is water is the creek is still losing water, but it's losing water at a rate that's a function of the permeability of the creek bed materials. And it flows through the unsaturated zone beneath the creek bed and then contributes to recharge of the underlying aquifer system. So SGMA requires that we identify creeks in the basin that are potentially connected or interconnected surface water and groundwater. I should mention that all of the previous investigations that have been done in the basin have assumed or conceptualized that all of the creeks in the basin that are outside of the confined area, which is shown in this hatched area here, are disconnected. So that's been the operating assumption in the basin for decades now. But Sigma requires us to demonstrate that. We can't just assume that that's the case, so we have to do some analysis. And the way we do this is we created depth to water maps for select periods representing 3 different types of water year types in the recent past. And basically what we do is through Geographic Information System mapping, or GIS mapping, we do math between the ground surface elevation and the water table elevation contours that I showed you earlier to determine the distance or the vertical separation, if there is any, between the ground surface and the water table surface. And so again, we did that for 3 different types of years. And what's shown here, this is a color flood map. So the orange and yellow colors, whoops, I'm sorry, keep pushing the wrong button. There's my pointer. You know, we range from about 600 feet in these areas of the basin here between the ground surface and the water table. But as you get into these creek beds, that distance decreases quite a bit. And that's just due to the topography. The creek beds are at lower elevations than these higher elevation areas, right? So this is like this is the Shepherd Mesa area, for example. Now, to make this abundantly clear to everybody, the way we mapped this is any areas in the basin where the depth to water was at or above the ground surface level. In particular, we're focused on these creek channels where that depth to water was less than or the depth to water was less than ground surface or above at or above ground surface. We've highlighted in this light blue color so that kind of pops out. And so this map shows those data for a wet year in the recent past. This is 2005. And what you can see here is the only areas of the basin where water levels are at or above ground surface is this area along the coast at low elevations in the basin. But again, this is in the confined area. So moving on to a normal year, so about 5 years later, we get to 2010. So this is just before we enter the current drought period. Same type of mapping here. But what you can see here is there are no areas under these basin conditions where the water table surface is at ground surface. And then here's a dry year, so this is spring of 2015. We're a couple years into the drought, and we see a similar situation as we did in 2010, where there are no areas where the water table is at the creek bed elevation. So what these data indicate is that in the unconfined areas of the basin, in particular the creek beds, the surface water and groundwater in this basin are disconnected. We don't have connected or interconnected surface water and groundwater. So moving on to groundwater dependent ecosystems, this is intimately related to internet-connected surface water and groundwater. The GSP regulations require us to identify GDEs, groundwater-dependent ecosystems, that could be adversely affected by lowered groundwater levels in the principal aquifer system. As I mentioned, could happen when I was talking about gaining streams and losing streams. So the way we did this was we downloaded which is referred to as the Natural Communities Commonly Associated with Groundwater data set from the Nature Conservancy. They've been doing a lot of mapping on this, and that data was provided to DWR and is disseminated by DWR for use by GSAs in assessing these issues. So this is a map showing the vegetation, the Nature Conservancy's mapping of potential vegetation, groundwater-dependent ecosystems, and they're shown in green here on this map. And what you can see is there are quite a few of them in the basin, and they're generally concentrated along the creek channels. Similarly, the Nature Conservancy provided coverages for potential wetland-related groundwater-dependent ecosystems, shown in blue here. And again, similar to the vegetation, we do have them in the basin, but they're concentrated again along the creek beds. So we needed to, those data sets provided for the Nature Conservancy were just based on satellite imagery, the types of plants that may or may not be GDEs. So those maps that I showed you initially were the mapping of potential GDEs. So we went through a screening process to see how many of those potential GDEs were actual GDEs that needed to be kept within the GSP and managed accordingly. And the way we did that is we did similar depth to water mapping that I mentioned earlier, but in this case what we're looking for is areas where water levels are within 30 feet of the ground surface, and 30 feet is commonly accepted indicator of essentially the root zones of some of these potential GDEs. So we did the same type of mapping, the same type of years that I mentioned earlier, but again, the difference is instead of mapping it for 0 feet, it's mapped for 30 feet below ground. So this one is for 2005, and what we're doing here is we're just highlighting areas in the basin where water levels are within 30 feet of the ground surface or potentially within the root zones of the plants. So this is again a high water level condition, and we can see in the central part of the basin we have fairly high water levels, lots of areas where the water table is within 30 feet, but mostly in the confined area. But we have this area in Rincon Creek here, where water levels are within 30 feet of the creek bed. And then also Arroyo Paradon Creek, and in particular right here on the very edge of where the confined area boundary is mapped. We have water levels within 30 feet under these conditions. Moving on to a more normal water condition, you can see that the areas where water levels are within 30 feet has shrunk as the water table has fallen a little bit during these periods. But again, we have this area along Rincon Creek where water levels are within 30 feet, and a similar area here along Arroyo Paradon Creek, just outside the confined area. And we see something similar here, but again to a lesser extent in 2015, which is a dry year. So again, we have this area along Rincon Creek, and then again this little area right here along Arroyo Paradon. So based on this screening, there are a couple of potential GDE areas that are going to be retained and going to be addressed in the GSP. All the rest of them we've screened out. So this is a smaller scale map view of the GDEs in the lower Paradon Creek area. So this is the creek here. This hatched area is the edge of the confined area that I've been talking about. So since it's outside the confined area, it's considered to be potentially affected by management activities within the principal aquifer. And we have both vegetative species in this area. I think it's mainly coast live oak, and then also some wetland species, and it's basically just in the creek bed here. And we have a similar situation again along the Rincon Creek area, so this is a smaller scale map. And so this area extends all the way up. We got Highway 150 here, getting close to the bedrock boundary. And then this is Shepherd Mesa up here, so it extends down into this area. So we have both wetland and vegetative. We got coast live oak down here. So the GSA and the GSP will be evaluating these GDEs further as we work through this process, and in particular when we get to addressing the sustainable management criteria as they apply to GDEs. So lastly, subsidence. For subsidence to occur, I'm not going to read through all of these, but basically what matters to us is whether you have aquifer system compaction as a result of groundwater withdrawals. As you may know, in the Central Valley of California, out along I-5, they have real big problems with subsidence. The ground surface out there in some places has fallen as much as 20 feet or so. But in the Carpinteria Basin, none of these conditions are previously known to be present. There's no known or any anecdotal evidence of subsidence that's been related to groundwater extractions in the basin. But to take that a step further, DWR has contracted with a firm that uses satellite data to measure the vertical displacement of the land surface. There's quite a bit of scientific technology that goes into that. But basically what they do is they're measuring the vertical displacement of the land surface. And in this case, the data that we have available is the vertical displacement between the period of June 2015 until just recently, July 2022. And what this map shows is that for most of the basin, there isn't very much displacement measured at all. The margin of error or margin of accuracy for these data is actually between 0 and 0.1 feet of displacement. But we do have this area here where these satellite data show that up to, about 1.3 feet of negative vertical displacement or dropping has been measured by these satellites. So 0.13 feet, that's 1.5 inches. Whether that's significant or not is something that the GSP technical team is still looking into. Whether or not subsidence is actually an issue in this basin that needs to be managed with sustainable management criteria. Those issues are still being evaluated. But this is what we know about this issue up to this point. So with that, I'm going to pause.
You're a little over time, so let's make a few questions.
Just a little over time, huh?
Being kind.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. It's a lot to go over. Yes, sir.
So on the Sentinel wells, are those wells pumped?
So the gentleman asked if the Sentinel wells are pumped. The only time that they're pumped is to collect the water quality samples. So these are small diameter wells. They're 3-inch diameter PVC wells, and their sole purpose is for water level and water quality monitoring. They're not used to supply water to, anybody else. So again, the only time they're pumped is when they're sampled. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the idea you have on why the groundwater seems to be going from the deep well as opposed, the seawater intrusion seems to be coming into the deep well as opposed to the higher wells?
Yeah, so the gentleman asked if we have any ideas as to why we're seeing what appears to be evidence of seawater intrusion in that lower zone and not the other zones. Well, again, we've only had these data for a couple of years. It's being evaluated. But in a nutshell, yes, we do have an idea. And it's basically more likely than not related to the density differences between salt water and fresh water. Salt water is slightly more dense, it's heavier, it has a higher specific gravity than fresh water. And so you have, what happens because of those density differences is in the offshore areas of the basin, there is an interface between fresh water and seawater, and because of those density differences, the shape of that interface forms a wedge where you have and so as the deeper you go, the more those density differences affect how fast or how far groundwater can move. It's a little bit heavier. And so and this is speculation at this point, but I think what we're probably seeing here is in that C zone, the toe or the bottom edge of the wedge is starting to migrate inland. The upper part of the wedge, which is more, or is fresher at the same location, we're not seeing anything in that A zone. And then in that B zone, we've got this kind of sloshing back and forth, maybe, so that's the best I can do with that. We think it's mainly due to the density differences between freshwater and seawater, and again, the deeper you go, the more influence those density differences have. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So it seems like where a well is in the basin, how deep it is, and how much is being extracted will have an impact on how it affects the sustainability of the basin. So are the rules that we're going to have to live under treat us all equally, or will certain wells be picked out as having more adverse effect than others, especially in relationship to what you said about the GDE situation?
Yeah, so the gentleman was asking if, because what we know about deeper wells affecting some of the issues in the basin, whether it's the potential GDEs or seawater intrusion, whether different wells in the basin are going to be treated differently based on their depths and how they may affect sustainable management criteria. That's an excellent question, sir, and it's one that we're going to be addressing over the coming year. Those are policy level questions that the GSA is going to have to make decisions about. Yes, sir.
Is there any data over the many years that would lead to any conclusion regarding sea level rise? And in turn, does sea level rise, or can it, or I should say it seems obvious it could, have an impact on the seawater intrusion equation?
Yeah, so the gentleman was asking whether sea level rise, which is projected to occur based on climate change, whether that's going to have an effect on, the rate or the potential for seawater intrusion to occur in the basin. And the answer is probably yes, it will have an effect. Whether that effect is significant or not, it remains to be seen, and that's something that we'll be evaluating as we move forward through this process and we start establishing sustainable management criteria for seawater intrusion. And those sustainable management criteria apply to the 50-year implementation period, and the DWR requires that we consider sea level rise as part of establishing those management criteria. So yes, certainly as seawater level rises, and again due to the density differences, whether that causes more seawater intrusion or not, or whether it's significant or not, is something that we'll be evaluating over the coming months. Yes, sir.
I think you've had seawater intrusion for many years, all the way up to Foothill Road, up
if,
Did you see that, with your presentation, did you come across that at all?
well, I think that more than likely, sir, without knowing exact, so the gentleman was suggesting that we've had seawater intrusion in the basin for many years, and that's evidenced by several wells in the polo field area that are no longer being used because the salinity has increased so much. Right now, we don't know for sure, but it seems unlikely that what you have seen at those wells is due to seawater intrusion, but rather water quality degradation from some of these other sources. So as I mentioned when I was discussing water quality, chlorides, total dissolved solids at those wells in section 19, which is right around where the polo fields are, whether what folks are seeing in terms of the salinity increases in those wells is actually due to other things going on in the basin, in particular this relatively poor water quality that seems to be coming down Arroyo Paradon Creek, and to the extent to which that is having a detrimental effect. Yeah. So again, that's an issue that we'll be evaluating in more detail, in particular when we start talking about sustainable management criteria. All right, let's move on. One more section, everybody.
I would give a hard 30 minutes.
Hard 30 minutes, all right. So what is the water budget for the basin? Well, this is a schematic that shows the different sources of inflows and outflows to the basin. Basically what a water budget is it's an accounting of the various sources of inflow or recharge to the basin, precipitation, infiltration of precipitation of the groundwater, surface water inflows from the basin boundaries, groundwater extractions, subsurface outflows, etc. And the water budget for the basin can be expressed in a very simple mass balance equation where inflows equals outflow plus or minus changes in storage. So it's not unlike your bank account. If you have more deposits coming into your bank account than you have withdrawals from your bank account, you're going to see an accretion in your bank balance. On the other hand, if you're putting less water or less money into your bank account than you're taking out, you're going to see your bank account balance go down. And so that's essentially what we're doing with the water budget, is sort of doing the water balance for the basin. So this is the main basic equation. The inflows, I don't have time to go into all of these and how we calculate them. They're based on various methods that have been established primarily by the previous investigations that I mentioned. But the components of inflows to the basin are percolation of precipitation. So this is rainfall that falls on the ground and makes it through the root zone and makes its way to the water table. We have subsurface inflow from the bedrock boundary. So this is water that's flowing through the fracture system in the upper part of the bedrock and actually feeding water into the groundwater aquifer system. We have stream bed percolation, as I mentioned. We have irrigation return flows. So there's a certain amount of water that's applied to crops in the basin that isn't used by crops and actually percolates down and contributes to recharge. And then we have subsurface inflow across the boundaries of the basin, both with the Pacific Ocean and the Montecito groundwater basin.
Could that be saltwater?
Could be. Outflows in the basin, there are 4 basic ones here, but groundwater pumping is the main one. Groundwater pumping is the biggest outflow in the basin. These other components are relatively minor. So Sigma requires us to do 3 types of water budgets, or water budgets covering 3 different types of periods. The first is the historical period, which I'll be discussing in more detail in a moment. And for the GSP, the historical period of water year 1985 through 2020 has been selected. And then the projected water budget goes out of 50 years past the adoption of the GSP. I have it out here to 2073. And then also there's a kind of a quirky thing in the Sigma regulations. It requires the development of a current water budget. And it's somewhat ill-defined in the regs as to what current means. But we've selected the period of 2012 to 2020, which is a subset of the historical period, to represent the current water budget conditions. And that was picked primarily because this is the current drought period, and what's gone on during this period has really led predominantly to the basin conditions, in particular water levels. So this is a graphic of the historical water budget inventory on an annual basis. And each one of these bars shows the inflows to the basin each year on the upper part here. So these are inflows up here from all these different sources. So this is a stacked bar chart. We stack each one on top of each other to get the total amount of inflow or recharge. And then on the bottom here are the outflows from the basin, which is mainly pumping, both by the water district and private agricultural users in the basin. And then this black line shows the cumulative change in storage from one year to the next, kind of like your bank account balance would look if you graphed it up, at least if maybe you weren't doing so well under these conditions anyway. So what you can see here is that when it comes to recharge, we have many years of relatively low amounts of recharge, punctuated by these wetter years where we get lots of recharge in one single year. We have years, for example, in 1998 here, where we get over 10,000 acre-feet of recharge just in one year. Pumping, on the other hand, doesn't change a whole lot. It's fairly consistent year to year because, crops and people, we're here regardless of whether it rains or not. We still need to drink water and the plants still need to grow. So pumping doesn't change all that much, but what we do see is pumping increases naturally during these drought periods to meet demands. In particular, agricultural pumping during drought periods tends to increase because the growers have to make up for deficient soil moisture because of the lack of rainfall, so they need to pump harder. So you have sort of a double whammy there when you get into drought periods. So again, what we see here is this late 80s, early 90s period. We see a depletion of storage, some recovery of storage, some declines again, but relatively stable through the 2000s, and then again till we get to about 2012 here. And you can see we have very little recharge, except maybe a couple years we got a little bit of recharge here. But overall, during this period, we have very deficient recharge relative to the long-term mean, and corresponding increases in pumping during these years, and we see the storage declining in response to that imbalance between inflows and outflows. So this table summarizes the averages over that 36-year period from 1985 through 2020. And I won't go through all of these details, but these are the numbers. This is in the GSP, but I want to highlight a couple of important things here. First of all, on the recharge or inflow side, percolation of precipitation ranges from 0, right? So we get years where even if it rains, we don't get any deep percolation, to quite a bit, almost 7,000 acre-feet of precipitation in some years. And precipitation or rainfall represents the vast majority, as a single component anyway, of recharge to the basin. We do have a little bit, significant but more minor components of stream bed percolation and subsurface inflow from the bedrock area. Over this 36-year period, so again from 1985 through 2020, the average annual inflow to the basin has been around 3,800 acre-feet a year. On the outflow side, as I mentioned before, pumping represents something, what does that add up to, like 90% of the outflows from the basin. Pumping by the district represents about 28%. Let's say round it up to about 30%. Private pumping's around 60%. So those will add up to about 90%. And so again, during this 36-year period, we have an estimated little over 5,000 acre-feet a year on average during that period. And that has led to an average annual deficit on the order of 1,300 acre-feet per year on average. And then if you just multiply that out by 36 years, we're seeing 48,000 acre-feet of cumulative storage depletion in the basin over the past 36 years. Now again, this is skewed quite heavily by these last several years since 2012, and so I want to caution everybody that this period, even though we've done a historical water budget because we're required to by SGMA, this is not necessarily the sustainable yield of the basin. Okay, that's going to be a slightly different number. We're going to be presenting our analysis of that in future workshops. But this is basically just the state of the basin as we understand it over the past 35 years or so. Well, now you can ask me lots of questions about all that.
So, since we're at the end of the presentation, perhaps we can have those of you who want to ask questions come up to the podium, and we'll try to answer them from the panel. And I do have a speaker slip, but I think Tony Brown, did you leave? I think I saw him.
I have one up here, Bob.
Yeah, can you read that one?
Sure. So this is, should I read their name?
Yeah, if you want to come up and ask a
I
question.
believe the name is Mike Clear?
I'll pass.
Oh, you pass, okay.
Catch it another time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I do, Tony Brown did put a question slash comment and indicates basin map problems. And this is an opinion that he's expressed to me in other venues. And that is, he's over on the Ventura County side and does not believe that the mapping of the basin boundary is proper. And you did go into it a little bit in terms of how that is defined under Bulletin 118. And Jeff, you talked a little bit about the process of basin boundary modification and how that is opened at DWR. And so maybe you guys can just comment on those two things. I think the basis for Mr. Brown's claim is that that historically they've never found water, in the areas that the basin boundary is delineated in, except for Rincon Creek.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in several of the slides in talking about both the hydrogeologic conceptual model and those cross sections, is we do have basin sediments, in particular the Casitas formation, which is the major geologic formation in the basin, is known to be present in the Ventura County side. In fact, it's exposed at the ground surface in the Ventura County side. However, in particular when you get across the Rincon Creek Fault, but even on the other side of the fault, Ventura County is at the southeastern margin of the basin. And so as I mentioned before, the basin boundary is mapped and delineated based on the physical contact at the ground surface between unconsolidated basin sediments and consolidated bedrock, which is outside the basin. So just by virtue of that definition, as you get to the margins of the basin or the edges of the basin, the relative thicknesses of permeable sediments decreases quite significantly. And in fact, there are many areas of the basin along the boundaries where if you look at it in map view, any given parcel is within the basin because basin sediments are present there and are counted in particular, even if we don't talk about pumping, but those basin sediments receive recharge from rainfall. And so water falling on those basin sediments contribute to basin recharge and are considered part of the basin. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily can drill a well that can produce a significant amount of water because the sediments there are so thin. So that is again going to be a policy issue that the GSA is going to need to wrestle with. There are situations, and we've seen this in well logs, and we've dealt with this in calibrating the numerical groundwater model, which we'll talk about in a future workshop, where we have wells, again, along the margins of the basin, not so much in Ventura County, but up in the hilly area, where in map view, the well is plotted within the basin boundaries. But then when you look at the well log, you see that that well is actually drilled through the basin sediments and is actually screened in the underlying bedrock and not in basin sediments, and is drawing water from the underlying bedrock. And so in those somewhat unique cases, I mean, this is a policy decision, but if the well is drawing water from the bedrock, it is by definition not drawing water from the basin and should be considered and regulated accordingly. So I suspect that the gentleman that you're referring to, Bob, may live in an area or own property in an area that is within the formal basin boundaries because sediments geologic deposits associated with the basin are present on the parcel, but the thickness of those sediments is so thin or meager that you can't drill a well that can produce economic quantities of water. Now, how you define economic, I think, is a moving scale. He might be able to, just as an extreme example, he might be able to drill a well that's, maybe 20 feet deep and can pump like 1 gallon a minute. Well, no one's going to do that because that doesn't work out cost-wise. And so those properties and those situations are very different than parcels in the central part of the basin where you've got this big, thick aquifer system and you can drill wells that pump, 500, 1,000 gallons a minute. So I think those are issues that the GSA will need to address when it comes to managing the basin. And Jeff, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would only add there's only a couple of opportunities to exclude areas from management. One is if we can make a technical case that the geology is not supporting pumping. That's one way, which I don't think is the case as you described. And you'd have to be able to make that case to DWR to change the basin boundary whenever they open that process up.
Right.
Now, the other opportunity is if the GSA decides that, well, there's a particular area that really behaves differently than the rest of the basin, we're going to set that aside, from management. That could be done as set aside as a different management area. And the third way is, DWR does allow for, it does define de minimis pumping as less than 2 acre-feet per year. And if their well produces less than 2 acre-feet per year, they get certain exclusions from concerns about management. So there's more details that have to be sorted out.
Isn't that a non-ag well, though?
That would be non-ag, that would be, again, most of the time that's defined as a domestic well. But the GSA could define it, all wells that produce less than 2 acre-feet.
So I have a question just to follow up exactly on this right here, which is if we do have a complaint about something structural to what's going on, just like Tony Brown's complaint about that map, what is our process to get that complaint up to DWR? Do we go through you guys? Do we call them ourselves? Is there any wiggle room at all?
Well, so the question is, what is the process to address a disagreement about how an area is being handled? Okay. Well, the first place is here at the GSA, trying to discuss and evaluate what that is. Is there scientific information to support one point of view versus the other? That's the obvious thing. That's what DWR expects. The other thing is, if there's more information brought to everyone's attention at a later date, say someone drills a well or they do some testing or something like that, if there's a need to reevaluate, the GSA can do that. The GSP can be changed. But it really, in order to change it, you would need to bring data and information.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, you're talking about two different things. One is a boundary modification through DWR, which has to be either scientifically demonstrated that it doesn't fall into the definition of the groundwater basin, versus a management area, which is a
different.
GSA, I think, initiated decision that is then approved through the GSP.
That's right. I think I was speaking more in general. If there's a decision made, how can you address it after the fact?
Okay, so we had, I wanted to get this into the record. We had a comment earlier that I said we would address at the end here about Santa Monica and Franklin Creek being lined and de-lined. And we'll just briefly talk about that. We have, as the water district and now as the GSA, produced a groundwater model, and that model was used to now analyze what would happen if you were to remove the lining of that creek. And I believe, Robert, you may have a little bit better handle on, that idea or that analysis. But, one thing you do have to remember from a policy standpoint, we have to balance two policy objectives. One is to keep flooding from damaging, the nearby improvements. So you can't really rip out a flood control structure without having some plan to mitigate the potential damage caused by floods, And so that agency that's in charge of that is the Santa Barbara County Flood Control. And so we would have to work with them to come up with a plan to basically handle those flood flows and debris flows and keep the surrounding area safe, but at the same time find a way to unline, I guess, the bottom of the creek where most of the infiltration would occur on that creek. So.
But if I recall history, the flood that happened in Carpinteria have been fires. We've had fires that summer, and then that winter we've had floods. So it's also been, somewhat due to the fires and the debris and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's a condition that's we believe is gonna worsen as climate change goes in the direction we think it's going. And so we do have to be ready for debris flows as well as flood flows. There is a debris basin that is at the head of Santa Monica Creek that I think captures a lot of the, particularly this last debris flow, caught a lot of the debris coming off of the mountain, but still some got through. And so
Where was there not a debris flow
I know that there is a debris basin up on Carpinteria Creek. I don't know the status of that. So, Robert, on the modeling, what was the sort of over-under on the recharge that would be gained if we were to remove the lining of Santa Monica Creek?
Yeah. Well, it's been over a decade since we did that modeling and since I wrote that up. So I'm reluctant to cite numbers because they will be wrong. They're in our 2012 report that we did for the district. But in a nutshell, my recollection was that the amount of recharge that we were talking about getting from delining those two creeks was on the order of maybe a couple 100 acre-feet per year on average.
Are there ways to increase that?
Perhaps. Those estimates that I mentioned and that we modeled were based on, so as I mentioned, there's been lots of studies done in the basin, and part of those studies have involved relating annual stream flow volumes in each one of these creeks to an estimated amount of percolation that would occur. And as the estimates of the water budget in the basin have progressed over the decades, and when Pueblo started working on this stuff a decade or so ago, recognizing that those creek beds were lined, the contribution of those creek beds to the overall water budget was essentially zeroed out. And so basically all we did in that 2012 study and in the groundwater model is we just put them back in. So we were, those estimates are relying on percolation estimates for those particular creeks that were made by previous investigators, like back in the 60s when they actually went out there and they took measurements of stream flow at the bedrock boundary and then again at the boundary with the confined area to see how much losses there were. And then they developed all these correlation indexes and things. So that's a long-winded way of saying that this is a topic that has been looked at by the Water Management District. The methods that we used to estimate it were relatively simplistic, however. And so there may be an opportunity to look at that. But again, I think, as Bob alluded to, there's a balancing between what at the time the Water District was capable of doing, both logistically, jurisdictionally. The Water District doesn't have jurisdiction over those flood control structures, nor does the GSA. So you have this sort of political complication or jurisdictional complication of getting something like that done. And then there's the cost issue,
There's also additional avenues of funding.
Certainly. So yeah, I think it's an issue that the consultant team and the GSA will probably be looking at, and it's a potential project being able to contribute to increasing recharge in the basin to achieve sustainability if that's needed. So it's definitely top of mind, and again, people have thought about this before, and it's just never gone anywhere up to this point. Maybe this is an opportunity for something like that to actually happen. Remains to be seen.
I have a left field question. If you back up to your previous slide, on the
Robert, is this related to the channel? Because we have a number of speaker slips. If you would fill out a speaker slip, that would be helpful. So let me go to Kim Jones. Would you like to ask the question, or would you like me just to read the question into the record? Okay. Does the water budget show that the basin is not sustainable from the historic data?
Not necessarily, no. Again, the sustainable yield of the basin is obviously intimately related to these data, but the sustainable yield of the basin, among other factors that need to be considered, is you need to look at a period of time that is representative of the long-term average condition in the basin. And this historical period of 1985 through 2020, which includes this 2012 to 2020 period of just really out of whack, deficient recharge combined with higher levels of pumping, doesn't represent the average conditions in the basin over the long term. So the issue of sustainable yield, again, is something that we will be addressing in future workshops. Whether the number is 3,800 acre-feet a year or not remains to be seen, but it'll be in that ballpark. Prior to the GSP, the previous working estimate of the sustainable yield of the basin, the last time we updated the water budget and did the groundwater model back in 2012, was about 4,000 acre-feet a year. So, that's the number you're probably looking at, give or take, 10, 20%, either way.
Robert, I wanted to add one point to this.
Sure.
So the concept of sustainable yield is one aspect of sustainability, but DWR requires us to define what is considered undesirable. That's sustainability, is the lack of undesirable results. So the folks here and other stakeholders are going to have an opportunity to define what is considered undesirable. And that's a range of things. It's the water budget conclusions, it's the seawater intrusion, it's a bunch of factors that we'll get into.
Scott, I'm sorry, your writing is hard to read.
I did that intentionally.
Okay, it says historic data or something outflow. Would you like to come up and ask the question? Yes, okay, that'd be easier.
Give me an opportunity to rest my leg.
Scott Vanderkar. And I would say to Carolyn's point that there are other organizations and agencies that plan to de-line the creeks. It's in process, and we may find in our process that we will want to encourage that to go forward. So we wouldn't have the responsibility, the liability, and we wouldn't be leading the charge, but we might see that it is a real advantage to the groundwater basin. Along those same lines, I'm curious about the data that we have, and you may even have this, Bob, what the sewer outflow to the Pacific Ocean has been over the last 20 years or 30 years with the growth of Carpinteria. And that would be interesting for two reasons. One, if there's any connection between that and the depletion of the basin, because that water is not going into the basin, but also you, the water district, going forward with the injection of that water and what difference that might make. I couldn't tell on the slide if that was one of the inflow inputs, but I know we're thinking about that here in the valley. The second point that I wanted to ask, and maybe for a future, well, I think it would be for a future discussion in this, and that is, do we know what surface covering is best for percolation? For instance, avocado orchard. Is there a way to measure that? Do you have data that says, especially outside of that clay cap zone, that a certain type of covering of the earth's surface, of the soil surface, is better for percolation and recharging the groundwater? At one of the water, can't remember if it was a water district meeting or whether it was the GSA meeting, but the notion was suggested that maybe credits for that type of surface for those landowners
could be in order if it was seen as a real benefit to recharging the groundwater. Thank you.
Let me tackle the first question, which was regarding the sewer outflow. So surprisingly, the sewer inflow into the Carpinteria Sanitary District sewer treatment plant has actually declined over the last 20 years, and that's largely because of two things. The first is the implementation of low-flow plumbing fixtures. So, toilets used to take, 3 gallons of flush. Now they're down to 1.2 gallons per flush, and drip-tight faucets are now, standard, and so a lot of the inflow that was contributing to the sanitary district has been tightened up, if you will, through conservation and plumbing fixtures. The second thing that the sanitary district has been working on over many years is reducing their infiltration into their collection system through groundwater and stormwater. One of the challenges for sanitary districts is during high wet periods, high rainfall events, a lot of that water, instead of going into the storm drain system, it goes into the sewer system. And then what they have is they have a surge going to the treatment plant. They have to respond very quickly. It's not designed for that. Often you'll read in the papers where a particular sewer district had a spill event, which is a big no-no for the regional water quality from the regulators of the Regional Water Quality Board. And so they've, over the last 20 years, have been working on lining their manholes to make sure that the sides are waterproof and the lids are watertight. Any old clay pipes that may have gaps or breaks or cracks in the area that is in high groundwater, they've lined those or replaced them totally. And so the inflow has gone down. So it's down to about 1 million gallons a day on average per year in a year, and that equates to roughly about 1,000 acre-feet a year. The CAP project is a project that aims to capture that water at the treatment plant discharge, which discharges currently into the ocean, and utilize that as a potential water supply. The regulations for what we call an indirect potable reuse project requires that you have an environmental buffer, and that environmental buffer can be either a lake or groundwater basin. So in our case, we don't have any lakes. We're planning to use the groundwater basin as the environmental buffer. And so what we do is we take that water, we purify it to such a high level that it's not going to be a danger to the environment, but also it can be used for potable drinking water. We then inject it into the aquifer, and it will travel from that point of injection out to where we pull it out maybe 3 or 4 months later in our existing municipal wells. And so that project will have a secondary benefit that is likely to bring water levels up, particularly in that depressed area that Robert showed on the maps. While we're injecting, we plan to inject 24/7, 365. And so what we expect to happen is we sort of see a mounding action at the injection wells that will gradually work its way out to the points where we're pulling that water out. Whether it will have an effect elsewhere, we're not sure. We did do some modeling, and I'm going to turn it over to Robert to talk about some of the potential benefits of that hydraulically. So.
What's the anticipated date on this project?
We think,
I've been hearing about it for quite a while.
yes, well, we finally got some grant funding that we've been trying to get for quite some time. And so we're actually moving forward with the final design. We expect that'll be an 18-month process, and then construction will start shortly thereafter.
And how long is construction?
18 months to 2 years.
So maybe 3 years to 4 years.
Yeah, ballpark.
So as far as groundwater modeling goes, that is a project that we have already identified for evaluation under the projects and management actions of the GSP, and we will be modeling it with the updated groundwater model. But we have done some modeling of that project as part of the feasibility work and preliminary design work on the project. And I guess in terms of the overall benefit to the basin, as Bob mentioned, what we see is that by injecting that water at the locations that we've identified, which are in the central part of the basin and in the area sort of between the district's two main production wells, their headquarters well and their El Caro Park well, what it does is it sort of stabilizes water levels in that part of the basin, and it makes it so that you don't have these dramatic depressions develop. The other side of that coin, though, is what we also saw in that modeling is that when we get into periods of water level, basin water level high, and we get lots of recharge occurring in the basin, that the district needs to pump their wells in order to keep water levels in the aquifer system below ground surface and keep it from artesianing all over the basin. So there's a push and a pull on how that project will be operated depending on basin conditions. But on average, I think we were looking at something on the order of about 1,000 acre-feet a year of injection. Now, as I mentioned, the district during certain periods will need to pump their wells in order to manage water levels in the basin, but the district has a portfolio of water supplies. Groundwater is just one of them. So, you know, on a very simplistic level, every acre-foot of water that they recover from the groundwater basin as part of this CAP project is an acre-foot that they can leave in Cachuma Lake, for example, and can be used and stored for that, you know, those drought periods. So overall, what it does is it creates a stabilization of water levels in the basin. Now, whether or not that project in and of itself will be capable of achieving the various sustainable management criteria that are going to be developed for this basin, in particular, to increase water levels in the deeper C zone to overcome the density differences, that remains to be seen and is again something we'll be evaluating in future groundwater modeling over the next 6 to 9 months or so.
Okay, so I have another question from Case Van Weerden. Would you like to come up to ask the question? Okay, so the question is, with 18 inches of annual rain, does 40,000 acre-feet run into the ocean? And how about Rincon Creek? So, I mean, broad math, you know, I think Robert said the basin's about 8,000 square, or 8,000...
roughly 8,000 acres.
Acres, yeah. And 18 inches is 1.5, so you're looking at about 12,000 acre-feet of just water falling on top of the groundwater base. That doesn't include any of the water falling on the mountains and, you know, filtering into the streams and hitting the creeks as they come through the basin. So a lot of water with 18 inches is running off into the ocean. So, you know, the numbers that you saw, I think, with really high annual rainfall were on the order, for recharge, were on the order of 6,000. So most of the water that falls in rainfall goes to the ocean. Does that answer your question?
I just want people to be aware.
Yep.
That's a lot of water.
And then as far as Rincon Creek, you know, it's just one of the 5 streams that goes through the basin. It has the same, I think, hydraulic, the functional hydraulics or hydrology, where rainfall falls in the, you know, tributary area, and it flows down through various streams and then collects into the stream and runs. Some of it gets pulled into the groundwater, or, you know, sinks into the groundwater basin, but most of it goes to the ocean.
Yeah, and the other piece of that is quite a bit of the rainfall that falls within the basin boundaries is actually consumed by plant life. It's transpired. So that's crops, native vegetation that consume that rainfall from the soil zone before it ever has a chance to even recharge the basin. And so we actually need, depending on the type of land use you're talking about, we need somewhere between 8 inches of annual rainfall on irrigated lands and on the order of 11 inches of annual rainfall in native lands in order to overcome the soil moisture deficiency before we even get any recharge. But then once we start getting recharge and that soil moisture deficiency has been met, then you start seeing this ramping up of the amount of percolation of rainfall that we get in the basin. And so that's why during those wet years, we see quite a bit of recharge from precipitation, whereas in dry years, we don't see any a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think the most recent calculation for the average annual rainfall is 19 inches or 18 inches now. It used to be 21, but
Yeah, it's 17.
17,
or so.
yeah. So it's going down as well. All right, I don't have any more questions. We have a few minutes. It's about 10 minutes till 9. We wanted to wrap this up by 9, so go ahead.
So up on that table there, use the mic. Hello, Robert Abbott. So my question has to do with to follow up on Scott's point of percolation, and specifically in avocado orchards, I think that they would be excellent candidates for percolation. There's very few of these numbers that can change or that we have any control over. But it does occur to me that the percolation of irrigation water is something that we could control. Obviously, the pumped water is, that's we're recycling water from down below and bringing it up and hoping that it makes its way back down. My question is that on the delivered side, is that water that's delivered from the Carpinteria Water District, or is that water that's delivered from Cachuma? And if it is water that's delivered from Cachuma, then it seems to me that would be a very effective way of getting water into our basin, is to just make that number climb.
When you say water from Cachuma, the water district imports water from Cachuma and delivers it to various farms. Is that what you mean?
Delivered water versus pumped water.
Yeah, delivered water is water district water delivered.
So it could be pumped from the water district.
No, it could be, but it's really, what it's meant to do is delineate between someone who has on-farm well is pumping, that water comes out of the groundwater, is applied to the crops, and then some of it returns to the basin. Whereas the delivered is the water district may be getting it from Cachuma, maybe getting it from groundwater, maybe getting it from State Water Project. They deliver it to a farm, they use it and apply, and it makes its way back into the groundwater basin.
So I'm fantasizing here that in a year or two, maybe Cachuma spills, and we get a ton of Cachuma water delivered here, and we turn our sprinklers on, and it's raining at the same time, and our aquifer goes up. But we're not going to do it if we have to pay more for it than what we're paying for pumping.
Well, yeah, what you're talking about, I think, is what's called FloodMAR, managed aquifer recharge, which is using floodwaters to flood various different crops and let that water percolate through the ground and into the basin. And there's a lot of, I guess, new work being done in that area. Okay. We did a very cursory review of the root suitability of roots for avocados, because that's what we have mostly in Carpinteria Valley. And it didn't look that great, to be honest, because the root zones don't like to be wet for long periods of time, and that's really what has to happen is when you do flood mar, you gotta flood the fields,
Yeah.
let it sit at a depth until it makes its way into the groundwater basin.
Anyway.
Yeah, but I will say, you bring up a point about, you know, managed aquifer recharge, maybe not flood. When Kachuma spills, one of our strategies has been to be ready with injection wells to push water into the basin and replenish the basin. So that's a different way of doing it, but it's essentially what you're talking about.
This is exactly what is being contemplated in the Goleta Basin. And they've got a developed injection program right now. And historically, they only used to inject during spills because that was cheap, right? But now they've gotten to a point where their groundwater basin is so depleted that they're considering buying more state water, putting it into Kachuma so that they can inject more often and recover their basin more quickly. So yes, that is a real idea.
Yeah, and I would add to that that this is a concept that the Water District has been investigating for decades now, for quite some time. And it's referred to, it's very similar to the CAP project, which is injection of recycled wastewater. That's known as IPR, or indirect potable reuse wells. The idea of injecting surplus surface water supplies from Kachuma or State Project or other areas involves injecting potable water into a potable aquifer, and that's referred to often as aquifer storage and recovery, where you can inject water into a well and recover water from that same well or nearby wells. And again, this is something that the district has recognized as a potential opportunity for increasing basin recharge. It is specifically designed its most recent production wells, the headquarters well and the El Caro Park well, to be ASR compatible. We have done injection testing, ASR testing at both of those wells, and it was successful. It can be done in the basin. The district is poised to do that. It's really a matter of getting the water available to do it. I mean, up to this point, as Jeff had mentioned, that concept had been conceptualized as really only spill water. So once Kachuma is full, it's spilling over the dam face, and that water is essentially free to the COM members other than paying for treatment charges. So it's a very low cost opportunity to increase recharge in the basin. But times are changing, and there may be opportunities, for example, for all of these basins that are part of the Kachuma project, Goleta, Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, to operate the COM project and these groundwater basins in a more conjunctive manner to benefit all of these projects. So these are things that people have been thinking about, certainly, and we'll see where it goes. But again, ASR is another type of project that this consultant team has already identified as a potential project that can be implemented in this basin to help achieve the sustainable management criteria if needed.
All right, well, I think we're kind of out of time here, so thank you everyone for coming and participating. Again, we'll have a number of these meetings. The next one, I believe, is, I do have a date, I think it's November.
I think you said November 14th.
No, November 16th.
16th.
Yeah. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.